This is Still Unanswered. I'm Maya Ellison. March 26, 1997. A quiet, affluent neighborhood in Rancho Santa Fe, California. Deputies, responding to an anonymous tip, push open a side door and are hit with a pungent odor. They find 39 bodies, arranged with an almost surgical neatness, identical black clothes, brand new black and white Nike Decades, a purple cloth folded over the upper body. In the pockets, each person has a $5 bill and 3 quarters. What could lead 39 adults, middle-aged, educated, ordinary seeming, to calmly prepare for their own deaths, convinced they were boarding a spaceship? Today, we're tracing that story. We'll go back to the people who made it, the beliefs that held them, the comet that became the trigger, and the questions that still refuse tidy answers. Joining me is Dr. Erin Velasquez, sociologist of religion and a licensed psychotherapist who studied high-demand groups for more than 2 decades. Erin, welcome to Still Unanswered.
Thanks, Maya. I'm glad to be here. This is heavy, but important to get into.
Absolutely. Before we go deeper, Erin, let's start with the scene in Rancho Santa Fe. For listeners who've only seen the images at a glance, those visuals that became shorthand in pop culture, what did investigators actually find?
They found an orderly house members, called it the monastery, and 39 dead, yes, 21 women, 18 men, ages from mid-20s into their 70s. The bodies were arranged with care. Shrouds, those matching sneakers, the away team patches referencing Star Trek. Cause of death was a mix, barbiturates, alcohol, and asphyxiation via plastic bags, but the way they did it was methodical, in waves. Some who died earlier were arranged by those who died later. There's this striking attention to ritual, even in death. It's a scene that's both clinical and disturbingly intimate.
Yeah, I remember reading a deputy's account. Pungent odor, he said. It's an image that lingers. But we can't let the shock be the only thing we take away. So let's go back earlier to the 2 people who started what became Heaven's Gate, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. Erin, can you sketch their backgrounds?
Sure. Marshall Applewhite, Dew, as followers called him, was born in 1931 in Texas, son of a Presbyterian minister. He was educated, B and M.A. in music, and worked as a music professor, served in the Army. But his life had ruptures, a troubled marriage, allegations that cost him a job in academia, struggles with his sexual identity, and then the death of his father in the early 1970s, which sent him into a deep crisis. Bonnie Nettles, T., was from Houston, a nurse, steeped in theosophy, astrology, a mix of New Age leanings. When they met in 1972, something clicked. Nettles brought mystical certainty. Applewhite brought vulnerability and charisma. Together, they became the Two, a preaching duo combining apocalyptic Christian language and UFO cosmology.
It's important to underscore these were not 2 strangers from thin air. They were formed by histories, religious upbringing, personal crises, and an era that was open to new spiritual experiments. Bonnie believed extraterrestrials had foretold their meeting, right?
Right. She claimed to be in communication with next-level beings. That claim gave the partnership theological leverage. Nettles often outranked Applewhite at first in spiritual authority. Their message offered a radical reinterpretation of biblical language through the lens of UFOs and New Age thought. Earth as a classroom, humans as vehicles, and a next level one could ascend to if you were instructed to do so by authorized representatives like Tai and Do.
Which is in a way not entirely alien to older religious traditions. think of the idea of the body as a temporary container or of ascetic practices. But this version mapped that to extraterrestrial craft. Nettles' death in 1985 was a turning point. How did Applewhite reinterpret that event?
Nettles' death was the theological pivot. She had metastatic melanoma and died in 1985. For the group, Applewhite reframed this as evidence that the body is merely a vehicle to be discarded. "'Tis vehicle broke down, her personhood moved on." Where they earlier might have expected simultaneous bodily ascension, Applewhite moved the doctrine toward a model where the body could be abandoned when the soul was ready. That is a crucial theological shift that, scholars argue, opened conceptual space for a later mass leaving of vehicles. Without that reframing, it's plausible the final act wouldn't have fit their system.
So, Nettles' death didn't end the group. It changed it, made it more inward, more centered on Applewhite's interpretation, which brings us to the larger evolution, the roadshow years, the long communal life, and eventually the internet. Aaron, how did Heaven's Gate go from traveling the two to an isolated group with a website?
They began in the 1970s, traveling across the U.S., recruiting at colleges, churches, alternative spirituality centers. Early recruitment fit the era: New Age, ufology, seekers. They lived communally: strict celibacy, unisex clothing, short hair, taking new names. After the 1970s, they settled into a quieter existence: odd jobs, moving around, small-scale web design later on under the name Higher Source. Importantly, they were early adopters of the World Wide Web in the early 1990s, posting teachings, using Usenet, maintaining a site. The online reaction was often mocking, which pushed them inward. By the mid-90s, their recruitment shifted from outward outreach to preparing a small, dedicated class for graduation.
Higher Source. Ironically normal work, web design, clients. That functional surface complicates the caricature of them as simply deluded or non-functional. They were capable of work. They paid rent on a 9,000 square foot mansion in cash. But the theological core, next level, vehicles, and an anti-sex ethic, was deep. We have to talk about the ways they redefined suicide. Can you explain their position against suicide?
This is one of the group's rhetorical moves that scholars find chilling. On their website, they had a page titled "Our Position Against Suicide." They argued that true suicide is rejecting the offer to move to the next level when it's given. Abandoning your vehicle to board the craft is framed as obedience, not suicide. That linguistic redefinition allowed them to perform collective death while claiming ostensibly to oppose suicide. It's an attempt to shift moral language so an extreme act appears sanctified rather than self-destructive.
Language matters. The group changed definitions to make what they were about to do make sense within their internal ethics. That brings us to the celestial trigger everyone remembers, Hale-Bopp. How did a comet become the final sign?
Hale-Bopp itself was a very bright comet in 1997, visible to most of the world for months. There was a rumor, partly from a misinterpreted or hoaxed astronomical photo, that a companion object was trailing the comet, which some described as a UFO. Applewhite seized on that supposed companion as the marker residents of the next level had been telling him about for decades. For Heaven's Gate, the comet's arrival became a narrow window. The craft was supposedly coming to pick them up, and they had to be ready. That sense of a closing window is a common accelerant in millenarian movements. The sky sign collapses long-term expectation into an urgent present.
Urgency is a powerful force. The group prepared, rented the Rancho Santa Fe mansion in October 1996, bought alien abduction insurance, recorded exit videos. There's a lot of almost surreal detail here that the media grabbed onto. Matching sneakers, purple shrouds, the away team patches. But behind the spectacle were videos where members calmly explained their decision. Aaron, you've reviewed some of those tapes. What stands out?
Two things stand out. First, the calmness. The members explain their preparations in measured terms, often smiling, speaking of graduation and excitement. There's an absence of panic. Second, there's a rhetorical structure. They frame the act as rational, informed, and the culmination of decades of preparation. For an outside listener, that often raises difficult questions about agency. Did they freely choose this, or were they coerced? The tapes complicate a simplistic, brainwashed cultists narrative because these are adults articulating what they believe to be a rational decision.
And that's where the conversation gets morally jagged. We need to cover the actual logistics of the deaths, how the group staged it, the 3 waves, the method. Walk us through it.
The forensics reconstruct 3 waves across 3 days around March 22nd, 23rd, 1997. Members wore their uniforms, black shirts, sweatpants, Nike Decades, away team patches. They ingested applesauce or pudding mixed with phenobarbital, washed it down with vodka to hasten effects, lay down on beds, and placed plastic bags over their heads to induce asphyxiation. Those who died earlier were then arranged neatly by subsequent waves, the plastic bag removed, purple shroud folded over the torso. Marshall Applewhite was among the last to die. 2 members who died after him still had plastic bags on, unshrouded, suggesting no one was left to tend to them. The whole operation had a procedural choreography to it.
It's eerie to listen to. A ritual of departure. Let's step back. Who were these people? Popular myth paints them as naive kids, but the source material says otherwise. Describe the membership profile.
Most were white, middle-aged Americans. Many had college educations and middle-class backgrounds. Ages ranged roughly 26 to 72. Several had been in the movement for decades, some since the 1970s. They gave up marriages, careers, family ties. Many had long spiritual-seeking histories, other New Age paths, Eastern religions, alternative Christianities. Their decisions emerged from long-term, committed investment, not sudden impulse. That complicates a notion of them as gullible or newly recruited.
Which leads us into the contested terrain of brainwashing versus agency. Aaron, you've written on coercive persuasion, but also resist simplistic labels. How do you approach this?
I try to avoid lazy binaries. On one hand, they lived in an environment with heavy information control, an authoritative leader, rituals that cut ties to outside life, features that can contribute to coercive dynamics. On the other hand, many were long-term members who repeatedly chose to stay. They worked, engaged with clients, and articulated their beliefs coherently. We should ask, how much of their choice was internal conviction and how much was structural influence? For scholars like Benjamin Zeller, the answer is nuanced. These were adults with agency operating inside an intense, bounded system. Calling it brainwashing can obscure the theological commitments that made sense to them.
But, Aaron, you don't want to let Applewhite off the hook. How do you weigh his responsibility?
He had enormous moral and procedural responsibility. Applewhite was the central planner. He framed the theology, recorded Dew's final exit tapes, reinforced the redefinition of suicide, and ran the day-to-day discipline of the group. Whether we call him manipulative or sincerely convinced, he was the leader who made the final call and orchestrated the exit in a way followers accepted. That's not to say followers weren't culpable in choosing to believe, but leadership matters, especially when one person's interpretation of an event, like Hale-Bopp, becomes a life-or-death timetable for others.
And yet, we return to, could it have been prevented? There was no siege, no arrest, no obvious legal avenue. Families? Therapists? The group was private, cash rent, working under a business name. What interventions, realistically, could have changed the outcome?
Once a group is tightly sealed, emotionally bound, financially self-sustaining, and doctrinally closed, external intervention is extremely difficult without violating civil liberties. In cases like Jonestown or Waco, intervention led to catastrophic violence. Here, there wasn't the same set of illegal acts being perpetrated externally. It was people making a choice, albeit under conditions we find objectionable. Families did complain in some cases, ex-members tried to warn. But unless members themselves seek help or a member defects and is taken seriously by authorities, the state's ability to step in is limited. Ethically, that raises tough questions about adult autonomy versus protection from harm.
The line between protecting autonomy and preventing harm is slippery. I want to shift to the media reaction in 1997, how the public heard this story. The initial framing was sensational. Jokes, late-night monologues, images used as punchlines. How did that shape public understanding?
The media focused on the spectacle, the Nike shoes, the Star Trek patches, the purple shrouds, and often ridiculed the group. That simplification made it easy for the public to call them wacky and move on. But it obscured depths, long memberships, theological development, and the ethical question of why citizens commit mass agency to a leader. Ridicule also dehumanized victims, which is ethically problematic. It's easier to crack jokes than to sit with the sadness of 39 people who truly believed they were saving themselves.
Exactly. We're dealing with victims and choices. On detail, there were later copycat instances and subsequent deaths of former members. What happened in those cases?
There were troubling aftermaths. In May 1997, 2 former members attempted a copycat suicide. Wayne Cook died. Chuck Humphrey survived, then later died by suicide in 1998, found with a $5 bill and quarters and a note that said, "Do not revive." Another ex-member died by self-inflicted gunshot in May 1997. Those incidents show the long tail of trauma and the way ideas can linger even after the core group is gone.
That's haunting. The web presence of Heaven's Gate further complicates the legacy. The original site remains maintained by ex-members who left before the suicide. What role does that website play today?
It's a primary historical document and, in a way, a relic of the early web. It preserves doctrinal essays, FAQs, and the group's own position against suicide. Maintained by sympathetic former members, it's a window into how they wanted to present themselves, in their own words. For researchers, it's valuable. For the public, it can be unnerving because the words on the page still make internal sense if you accept their premises. That persistence complicates how we memorialize and study the group.
We should also anchor this in broader patterns. How does Heaven's Gate compare to groups like Jonestown, Waco, or the Order of the Solar Temple?
There are overlaps and critical differences. Jonestown involved coercion, violence, and over 900 deaths. There was forced mass murder-suicide in a politically charged context. Waco was a violent standoff with law enforcement that ended disastrously. Order of the Solar Temple also had simultaneous mass deaths tied to apocalyptic beliefs. Heaven's Gate was distinct. smaller, largely nonviolent toward outsiders, and marked by a particularly modern synthesis of ufology and Christian eschatology. Its voluntary seeming nature distinguishes it, but also makes moral analysis trickier. Fewer legal violations, more questions about informed consent and leader influence.
And the image of UFO religion sticks in the public imagination. Spaceships instead of angels. There's something about the modernity of it that captures people's fascination. Why do you think Heaven's Gate continues to fascinate us? Artists, filmmakers, podcast makers, decades later.
Partly because of the visuals. The juxtaposition of Nike sneakers and purple shrouds is cinematic. Partly because they were early internet adopters, an analog to digital story at the dawn of the web. There's also the tragedy of rational-sounding testimony recorded calmly, which creates cognitive dissonance. People committed a mass act they described as joyful. And finally, there's an existential curiosity. Why do people accept radically different metaphysical maps? Those themes never stop being interesting to us as a culture.
We're nearly at the end of our arc, but I want to leave listeners with still unanswered questions, lines of thought that refuse easy closure. Aaron, give me the top unresolved questions you think we should sit with.
Okay. 1. Was this suicide or religious martyrdom? From outsiders, it reads like suicide. From members, it was salvation. 2. How responsible is Applewhite? He was the leader, but followers stayed with him for decades. Agency and responsibility are shared and complicated. 3. Could it have been prevented? Legally and ethically, intervention is fraught, and practical options were limited. 4. Where's the line between extreme religion and dangerous cult? Many mainstream traditions include martyrdom. Context matters. 5. What do we owe the victims in how we tell their story? Respect, empathy, and accuracy, not ridicule.
Those are heavy, important prompts. I want to take a minute to read a short excerpt, paraphrased, from what Applewhite said in his final tapes. Listeners, his tone was calm. He framed the act as an evacuation because the planet is being recycled. He asked followers to exit the vehicle and presented this as the logical culmination of everything they had been taught. Hearing that calm, it's almost the hardest part to reckon with.
Yeah, the rhetoric of calm rationality is powerful. It's not the language of hysteria, it's the language of conviction. In therapy settings, that mix of conviction plus isolation is exactly where we worry about diminished capacity to choose differently. But we also have to respect that these were people who had thought about this for decades. The final moral question, respecting autonomy while protecting the vulnerable, remains unsolved.
Before we close, I want to ask you a personal question, Aaron. After studying these groups for 20 years, after hearing their words recorded calmly, what stays with you at night?
What stays with me is the ordinariness of the people. These weren't caricatures. They were neighbors, a choir director once, a nurse, people who wanted meaning and community. And I also think about the families left behind, parents, siblings, who had to explain this to the world. When we reduce these events to spectacle, we forget the human grief. That human cost is what I carry.
Absolutely. And for listeners who want to dig deeper, the History.com pieces, academic articles on their online presence, and the Heaven's Gate site itself are primary ways to look at the material. But read with care. These are records of a painful, complex human story.
And if I can add one more note, when we study groups like Heaven's Gate, we should do so with curiosity, but without romanticizing or simplifying. That means honoring survivors, consulting reliable scholarship, and resisting the urge to turn everything into entertainment. That means honoring survivors, consulting reliable scholarship, and resisting the urge to turn everything into entertainment.
I couldn't agree more. Next week on Still Unanswered, we'll look at another movement's final days and what institutional responses tell us about modern society's ability to protect or respect religious difference. For now, Aaron, thank you. This was thoughtful, somber, and necessary.
Thank you, Maya. I appreciate the careful framing.
And to our listeners, if this episode stirred up difficult feelings for you, please reach out to local resources. You're not alone. This story of Heaven's Gate is a reminder belief can be beautiful and dangerous, comforting and cruel. It deserves careful attention, patient empathy, and honest questioning. I'm Maya Ellison. Thanks for sitting with us. Still Unanswered is produced by a small team committed to thoughtful reporting on faith, harm, and the gray zones between. If you found this episode useful, tell someone, subscribe, and consider leaving a review. We'll see you next time.